Hello, my name is Kathi Bailey, and I am a trustee of TIRF, the International Research Foundation for English Language Education. And today I'm interviewing my fellow trustee, Dr. Nick Saville. Nick, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate your time. I have here that your title is that you are the Director of Thought Leadership in Cambridge University Press and Assessment in the English Language Division. And on top of that professional work that you do that keeps you very busy, you've been a TIRF trustee now for more than a decade, since I think 2014. What motivated you to take on the role in TIRF in the first place?
Well, I think it's a long story, really. I mean, I ever since I was a schoolboy, I've been interested in languages. Right, I got into, first of all, English, and then started learning French. And then went to university back in the 70s as an undergraduate doing linguistics. It's quite unusual back then, at least in England. And I came across teachers who were interested in second language acquisition. So even as an undergraduate, I became interested in second language acquisition. So when I was still at university, I started teaching in my summer holidays without any training, but, sort of conversation with French visitors to the UK, and then went to university, left university, and took up a job rather by chance, really, teaching in the University of Cagliari in Sardinia, which was a place I'd never heard of before being offered the job. So I started teaching English. Really a deep end strategy where I started, and I became really fascinated by the whole process of learning in instructed context, and decided to pursue that. But I also, well, very early came to the conclusion that assessment was part of that process. And many people, including myself, had to do assessment without any fundamental training in it. So carrying on to do my master's and then my doctorate eventually, I narrowed down my pathway around learning, teaching, and assessment. So by the time I was encountering TIRF, which was, as you say, was about 12 or 14 years ago, I'd already got a deep interest in this profession and had developed a title. My previous title was Director of Research and Validation. So I've become really interested in research and validation around language assessment. And my erstwhile colleague, Michael Milanovic, and another friend, Michael Carrier, had already got involved in TIRF, and they suggested that I should also seek to involve myself in that. By then, of course, I was pretty well established in Cambridge, and also had taken part in a lot of international work around learning and assessment. So I think it was a sort of progression through a career in language learning, teaching, and assessment, which took me to TIRF as a destination, if you like. And I've really enjoyed it in the last decade, as you know.
Well, I'm so glad that worked out well. I remember working with Mike Milanovic for many years, and of course, still work with Michael Carrier. So, given that pathway that led you to TIRF, among other things, what have been the rewards that you've experienced while volunteering for TIRF?
Well, I felt very humbled to start with by joining a really great bunch of trustees of immense fame and representing expertise of many types. Obviously, many of them senior to me, people who I've looked up to in the past, and engaging in that community has been really rewarding. But also, I would say the mission of TIRF itself and representing Cambridge, being able to bring in what we can offer in well, first of all, by way of sponsorship to support the doctoral dissertation awards, but also ways in which we've been able to make connections across our networks and to promote the work of TIRF in ways which I think has been mutually beneficial, both to us in Cambridge, but also for widening awareness of the TIRF mission. And that's really, it's great fun. And getting together at the TIRF meetings, having a drink with the other trustees, sharing our experiences, that's always what keeps people working well together. And I've missed that, when we've had lockdowns and not been able to get together.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. You mentioned that part of your title is that you're the thought leader. What does that position entail?
Well, I think I've given that some thought myself because it becomes something of a must-have role in organizations, and that you hear people attributing that to themselves or being given that role. So I've sort of broken it down into areas which I think are important for thought leadership. Thought leadership, I think, from an institutional point of view, creates credibility and trust, which sort of extends from individuals to the organization or the brand, if you like, that they represent. So it's really important for presidents of organizations or CEOs in a leadership role to have some kind of thought leadership position in the way they guide their institution. But I think there is also below that, if you like, within organizations, thought leaders are informed opinion leaders, particularly the go-to people in their field of expertise. So potentially they're industry experts in some domain or other. I don't think it matters what background they come from. They can be any age, gender, or ethnicity. But I don't think just anybody can be considered a credible thought leader. What is necessary? Well, thought leadership I think it takes time to accumulate the necessary experience and profile. You've got to have got some background in something. It requires some recognized knowledge and expertise in a particular domain, or potentially in a niche or a small part of a domain, and possibly some kind of willingness to challenge the status quo or to question the way things are done, so that it maybe goes against the grain sometimes when raising issues which are not necessarily the orthodoxy. Having said that, they must in some ways be able to be seen as trusted people, potentially able to inspire people who they're talking to because of their domain expertise, or potentially because they have innovative ways of thinking. So really, recognize profile, image, wide exposure to ideas. These are all central. I think really what you want to do, though, is to give your thought leaders access to people in an organization so that they can help make things happen. A thought leader shouldn't just sit by the window having thoughts themselves. Their job is to help other people have thoughts, if you like, and to have a certain status and authority in order to influence the direction of travel, or to help people make progress in some ways. I think you'll find that people who are credible thought leaders have an image or an exposure which leads them to getting invitations to take part in things, to join boards or to serve on commissions, participate in industry-wide committees and the like, and where their opinion, whether controversial or not, is valued because it's backed up by some kind of domain knowledge or experience. So I'm lucky enough, I think, to be able to have a way of working in Cambridge these days, you could say in the latter part of my career, without having to manage the same number of people, but having a role to help people think about things and to bring in ideas for debate or consideration.
That's really interesting.
Does that strike you as a credible sort of definition?
It does. And I understand the concept a lot better than I did 4 minutes ago. So thank you for that. I would agree that based on my experience with you, you are indeed a thought leader. I know you've contributed a great deal of innovative thinking to the TIRF board. So thanks
I
for
tried
that.
to
Um,
boil it down,
I want
just to finish off that thought. I tried to boil it down to help other people understand it. And I tried to, it's quite common these days to try and deliver something as the 3 Cs or the 3 Ds or something. So I came up with 3 Cs of thought leadership. Uh, Develop and exploit content, make connections, and build communities. So content,
nice.
connect, communities. And I think that is a sort of summation of the things I said in a much longer way.
That works very well as a summation. One of the areas where you've contributed a lot in terms of time and expertise has been with ALTE, the Association of Language Testers in Europe. And I wanted to ask you to tell our listeners a bit about what that role involves, please.
Well, again, I have to put up my hand and say that this experience derives from my long collaboration with Michael Milanovic, who was the one whose original idea, led to the setting up of this association back in
Mhm.
1990. But I was there at the start with Mike, and we set out to establish a multilingual association of like-minded organizations interested in learning and assessment of languages, not just, like in our case, English, but those who have an interest in teaching and assessing their own language, starting with the widely spoken ones like French, German, Spanish, Italian, but also extending to the less widely taught and less widely resourced languages. And right from the start, languages like Catalan were present. And so I've been really supporting that mission now since the very beginning. I've been to all of their meetings over the last 35 years. We're just about to have the 61st meeting and conference day in Istanbul next week. So I'm really looking forward to that. But I think it's great to again take a long-term view of how something can evolve, but still maintain the same. So I think this is true also of TIRF to some extent. ALTE has sort of its goal is striving for fairness in language assessment, really, and it does this by setting standards, professional standards, and also standards around the concept of proficiency, like levels of achievement, and through what I think is the core of it all, collaboration and sharing of know-how from a level playing field, so that all voices being equal, all voices having a role, not a hierarchical sort of big languages, big voice, little languages, little voice. And I think that willingness to collaborate on that basis has led to the success of ALTE growing now to a well-established charitable organization managed by a board of trustees like TIRF, and representing many of the languages of Europe, and also involving, because of the way we organize ourselves these days, participation from across the globe, with collaboration coming from Latin America and Asia, as well as from the wider European context. And it's not, just to be clear, it's not an European Union construct of any kind. It's Europe in the sort of old style of the continent of Europe, as the origin of it. And I think the willingness of members to continue to engage and to grow is part of its success, right? Nobody has made anybody do anything. It's everyone chips in and takes part, and we have some really great special interest groups Recently, we've got a new group on social justice, which has come along, which I think is really in keeping with the zeitgeist on how assessment needs to be seen from different perspectives, whether that's a Southern perspective or a Black perspective or a different cultural perspective, not just the same old, perpetuation of ideas. So yeah, essentially multilingual though. I think it's the one thing I would point out. It's the only association of its kind which is fundamentally multilingual.
Mm-hmm. I remember attending, I think it was the 2016 17 conference in Bologna in Italy. And I'm just going to step aside from this interview here to give some advice to our audience. And that is, if one of your dearest friends and colleagues ask you to be a speaker at a conference and you agree to that, then just be careful when he says that your assignment is to update some research you did 20 years before. As I said yes to Nick about a paper I'd published in 96, and then for the next year and a half struggled to read all the research literature that had happened since that time. So I found the ALTI conference to be really invigorating. The people were excited, they were engaged, they were ready to talk and share their ideas and ask questions. It was, in addition to being an excellent academic conference, it was a lot of fun. So although preparation was a struggle, I appreciate your
have you,
inviting.
particularly on that topic, which is dear to my heart, because Arthur Hughes from Reading University was one of my early teachers. In fact, he was one of my undergraduate teachers, actually, who got me interested in language acquisition. But he was also he drafted the paper which you picked up on in regard to washback, and which
that's right.
Go back and revise for that presentation, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. And his work on washback, as it's present in his books as well, has been really helpful to teachers in understanding the importance of language assessment. So great.
So we were really pleased to have it.
I want to ask you more about ALTE. I was recently looking at the conference proceedings online. I was looking up something for the TIRF reference list collection, and I was really surprised to see that all those books, the conference proceedings, are free. People can download them. And I wonder if you have any advice for our listeners about how to make use of that resource, or if you know how people are using the conference proceedings from the ALTE conferences.
Well, it's a really good question. And it's quite, you'll see if you look at those conference proceedings, 4 of them are published in the Studies in Language Testing series, which is a series which we launched in Cambridge, and which is actually coming to the end of its natural life with the publication this month of the 56th volume. And the current editors of the series are myself and Linda Taylor. We're just about to conduct an evaluation survey of how people have used those volumes of different kinds, which make up those 56 in the collection. And we'll send it out widely. And in fact, TIRF could help us distribute the questionnaire to find out how people have used these. They're also, producing volumes, unfortunately, takes a long time. And quite often the information that's in them comes out 2 years after the event has been held. So more recently, we've tried to have a lighter touch, and not so much to create the best academic publication, but to make sure that the information that was presented at the conference becomes widely available to people in a form which they can access. And if they're interested in follow up, either with the authors or with the references they pick up in going through that. So in the interest of wider and quicker dissemination, we have not gone down the road of publishing them in book form, but tried to edit them through our own structures. So you'll see that we put together editorial committees which help get out the presentations into a an acceptable format. And this is challenging because we do it in English, but of course, ALTE does publish a lot of stuff in the languages of the people who are specialists in those languages and not in English. So, I mean, it's a bit unfair, really. I mean, even though it's a multilingual conference, we publish the proceedings mainly in English. That does create challenges for, the academic discourse that you expect, and it's a long-standing problem of equity, really, of if you're dealing multilingually, getting everybody then to talk about things in English. So I would say to access the information to find out what's going on in the diversity of language testing, which you probably haven't heard about in relation to languages like Slovene or Basque or Welsh or a whole plethora of less widely spoken languages. And that's just really interesting in its own right. But I think if you're approaching this from say, a Latin American or Asian perspective, and you haven't got a community yet in place, there are things that could be, I wouldn't say learned in the sort of sense of follow our example, but there are things out there which could stimulate thinking, thought leadership ideas, if you like, for doing these kind of things elsewhere. So it's a resource which you can dip into. And if you dip below the surface into that ALTE website, many of the documents are indeed written in other languages, including less widely spoken ones. Each member decides if they want to do the adaptation or the translation, so if they've got the resources to do it. So it's not like everybody translates everything, but we've recently got a project with the Council of, well, not with the Council of Europe, but based on the companion volume of the CFR, to produce a handbook for alignment issues, which has been done by several associations working together. So ALTE with EALTA, UCALTA, British Council, and collaboration with the Council of Europe. And just this last week, ALTE members have translated that or adapted that into German and Spanish, right? So I think that is a big contribution as well, making resources available in other languages for the community, which are difficult to get hold of otherwise. So I would say you use it a bit like the resources in TIRF, which is a fantastic repository of information and academic references. To find stuff, go to it as a go-to place and look. And if you can't find it, perhaps contact us, because it may be just difficult to find. I mean, websites are not always transparent. So use it as a resource. It's the summation of that.
Excellent. Thanks, Nick. I'd like to wrap this up, if you don't mind, by asking you a more personal question about your own life. My understanding is that you are now a grandfather and that you raised your own children. Okay. And you raised your own children, at least bilingually. And could you tell us a little bit more about your own perspective as a multilingual person and about your family?
Yeah, so I'm like a true Brit. I grew up in a completely monolingual environment with, however, quite strong dialectal influences on my family when I was growing up. So bi-dialectal, if not bilingual. And then French was a boring subject at school until I discovered that people actually speak the language, right? So I really became enthused by it after going to France and encountering French people for the first time. Now, that isn't the experience of the majority of people in the world. I've discovered the majority of people in the world grow up surrounded by languages being used in their community on a day-to-day basis. I don't think language education takes advantage of that, actually, that the majority of people are, I would say, plurilingual in the sense of they have individual multilingualism. That's what I mean by plurilingual. They have a repertoire of languages or language skills, which includes being bi-dialectal, but also means having capacity to operate in sometimes 5 or 6 languages, right? Even without having studied them formally, which I find fascinating. So language learning can be natural or it can be difficult, like my experience with France. So what I'm interested in is how we can promote plurilingualism in people's lives, right? Take advantage of the fact that often there are um, factors, circumstances which make it possible to acquire more than one language or some of the skills in more than one language, if not all of them. So since I went to live in Italy, I married an Italian person, and that's where I learned Italian. And being in Sardinia, I also became quite interested in Sardinian as a another language with multi-dialects. Something I'm picking up now in my old age is one of my sort of hobbies. But my children struggled growing up in England with the same general surroundings of being in a monolingual country. So we tried to expose our children to Italian as much as we could. And my son is pretty much bilingual. He's the oldest. And my daughter is a complete fluent translanguager in Italian. That is, that we talk to her in Italian and she replies to us in English. And so that's her experience of being brought up. So 2 children, different outcomes. But my daughter's son, who's our oldest grandson, who's 3, my wife and I have at least one day a week where we speak to him only in Italian. And we've done that since he was born. So he's 3 now over the last 3 years. You can ask him a question in English or Italian, and he will either do or give him an instruction. He will either do it automatically, whichever language, or he will respond in a way which is appropriate. Largely at the moment in English, so he's translanguaging like his mum. But already at 3, he's starting to use words in Italian. When we're there, we don't distinguish. You know, if he wants to speak English or he wants to speak Italian, and we, although we try and speak Italian, obviously we translanguage as well. So the important thing, I think, is exposure, really, and to make it seem the most natural thing in the world to have people using other languages, right? Not a big deal when you go to school and you have to suddenly be confronted by a book with something in it, which is frightening and alien. And he's called Raphael, and he's now goes to nursery school. And the nursery school teachers, they are teaching the kids some words of Spanish. So this is quite easy for him. And his dad said to the nursery school teachers, oh, but you know, he already understands Italian. They found it quite difficult to believe because I don't think any of the other kids had it, you know. And a lot of people don't understand that that's perfectly normal, right? That a child of 3 can be perfectly fluent in understanding another language without having been taught it. So I'm a real enthusiast for developing plurilingual competencies. And it's never too late, right? This is the point. So you can add more competencies to your repertoire. And it doesn't have to be full competence. It's, you know, a few words adds to the repertoire. If that's of Turkish, if you're going to Turkey, or Japanese, if you're going to, and you know this really well, Kathi, because I'm sure you've over the years, everywhere you've been, have sought to pick up some of the language and have developed your own plurilingual repertoire by just having that attitude towards it. What's your view on it?
It's so interesting that you say that. Yesterday, I learned the Spanish word for cradle because I bought a new house plant called a peace lily. And my girlfriend, who's a native speaker of Spanish, told me that the Spanish name for this flower is the cuna de Moises, Moses's cradle, because of the shape of the flower. And her brief explanation was so powerful and connected with this flower right in front of my face that I now know, and I don't think I'll forget the word for cradle, even though I have very little use for that word. But it's so fun to learn languages and to feel that you can communicate. In my case, however, haltingly with people from other cultures, other nations, other traditions. So, Nick, I want to thank you for your time and your insights. It's been so fun to talk with you today. Before we sign off, is there anything else that you'd like to share about TIRF or your own work with our listeners?
No, well, all I'd say is, TIRF is a great organization to stay in touch with. And if you've got any um, interest in supporting language education and research, please engage with TIRF. Feel free to donate if you would like, or if you are preparing graduate students or teaching people about research in language education, use the TIRF resources and seek to apply for one of our awards. I mean, they seem to make a difference to people, I would say. Having talked to people who've experienced their interaction with TIRF over the last decade, that's my view. It makes a difference.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your input. That's the end of this particular interview. We look forward to talking to others and sharing the insights from TIRF's team with the wider educational community.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's been great to talk to you again, Kathi.